Rome, 67 AD. Crowds gathered in the forum as Emperor Nero appeared, his every step drawing the eyes of the city. At his side walked a breathtaking young bride, her silks shimmering in the sun, her jewels flashing like fire. The people stared in awe, but every soul present knew the dreadful truth. This empress was no woman at all, but a boy named Sporus, forced into a role that defied nature itself. What Nero had done to him was not love, but domination twisted into obsession, an act that would echo as one of Rome's darkest scandals. If you're into dark history tales, hit subscribe. When Nero first ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was only 16 years old, a boy emperor ruling the largest empire on earth. To many Romans, it felt like the beginning of a golden age. Taxes were reduced, lavish games filled the arenas, and Nero himself stepped onto the stage to perform music and poetry, delighting crowds who had never seen a ruler so eager to entertain them. But power is a dangerous gift, especially when given to someone so young. In those first years, Rome saw glimpses of generosity and vision. Yet beneath the surface, paranoia began to take root. Surrounded by flatterers and sycophants, Nero slowly learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that no one could ever tell him no. Into this world stepped Poppæa Sabina, a woman whose beauty was said to outshine all others in Rome. She was not only striking, but clever, ambitious, and unafraid to command attention. Compared to Nero's quiet and neglected wife Octavia, Poppæa was everything the young emperor desired. What began as an affair quickly consumed him. Nero's infatuation spiraled into obsession. He showered Poppæa with treasures from across the empire, silks from the east, perfumes from Arabia, jewels worth fortunes. He divorced Octavia in a scandalous move that shocked Rome, then married Poppæa in a ceremony of staggering luxury. But gifts and marriage were not enough. Nero began isolating her, surrounding her with spies disguised as protectors, ensuring that no man could even glance at her without fear of his wrath. What looked like devotion was, in truth, possession. Ancient writers tell of Nero watching her for hours, as if she were an object created solely for his gaze. Yet Poppæa was no passive victim. She used her influence to build alliances and protect her position. But she also carried a dangerous flaw. She was not afraid to stand up to Nero. That defiance would one day prove fatal. The end came suddenly and violently. Ancient sources disagree on the details. Some claim the couple argued over Nero's late-night chariot races, others that Poppæa mocked his artistic ambitions. But all accounts agree on the outcome. In a fit of rage, Nero struck her. She was pregnant at the time, and the blow, whether a single vicious kick or a brutal assault, caused fatal injuries. As she collapsed, bleeding and unconscious, Nero's fury gave way to horror. The emperor who commanded legions and was worshipped as a god now wept like a child, cradling the woman he had adored to death. Physicians were summoned, threatened with torture if they failed, bribed with riches if they succeeded. But no skill could undo the damage. Within hours, Poppæa and her unborn child were gone. Her death shattered Nero's mind. He refused to cremate her as Roman custom demanded, instead embalming her body, building a shrine in her honor, and speaking to her as though she still lived. It was grief twisted into denial, and the beginning of his descent into madness. Amid Nero's spiraling grief over Poppæa's death, another figure quietly lived within the palace walls. A young freedman named Sporus. He had grown up in the emperor's household, educated and trained for service, enjoying privileges that most Romans could only dream of, yet always utterly dependent on imperial favor. What caught Nero's shattered attention was not Sporus's intelligence or skills, but his face. Ancient writers claim the boy bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Empress, especially in his eyes and delicate features. To Nero, it was as if fate had offered him a chance to undo the past. For Nero, resemblance was not enough. If Sporus looked like Poppæa, then he would become her. The emperor summoned physicians and ordered them to perform surgery, a brutal procedure meant to strip away the boy's manhood and make him appear more feminine. Ancient medicine was primitive, the risks of infection and death enormous, but Nero cared little. To him, Sporus was not a person, but raw material to be reshaped into his fantasy. The operation left Sporus permanently altered, his identity shattered before it had even fully formed. He was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead Empress, and prepared for a role he had never chosen. Seamstresses tailored gowns to disguise his body, jewelers refashioned ornaments once worn by Poppæa, and cosmetics were applied to soften his features. Tutors drilled him daily, how to walk, how to sit, how to laugh with graceful restraint. Voice coaches pushed him to speak in higher tones to erase every trace of his true self. Every mirror became a torment, reflecting back not Sporus, but a stranger crafted for another man's obsession. Each jewel, each silk dress, was not a gift, but a shackle. Piece by piece, his humanity was stripped away until only the illusion remained, Poppæa reborn. In the spring of 67 AD, Nero unveiled his grotesque creation to the world. The emperor staged a full imperial wedding, an event of music, feasting, and dazzling display. Flowers from across the provinces adorned the palace halls, oil lamps blazed in the night, and Rome's elite gathered to witness what should have been a union of triumph. But beneath the spectacle lurked horror. At the altar stood not an empress, but a teenage boy mutilated into Nero's vision of his dead wife. Sporus, now called Sabina, was dressed in silks and jewels once worn by Poppæa herself, every detail reinforcing the fiction that she had returned from the grave. The vows were exchanged, the rituals completed, and the court applauded with forced smiles. No one dared speak the truth. Rome's emperor had married a living ghost, and his madness was now law. From that day forward, Sporus lived as Nero's Empress. He was given attendants, a household staff, and a place beside the emperor at banquets and public ceremonies. Outwardly, it looked like luxury. In reality, it was captivity dressed in gold. Every moment became a performance. Nero called him by Poppæa's name, spoke of memories that never belonged to him, and expected Sporus to answer as though he remembered them too. A wrong glance, a hesitation, could cost him his life. The boy learned to anticipate Nero's moods with uncanny precision, smiling when commanded, grieving when required. But behind the mask, ancient sources describe him growing increasingly withdrawn, his spirit eroded by the endless charade. He was alive, but living as someone else's ghost. By 68 AD, Nero's empire had turned to dust beneath his feet. Once adored as a young prodigy, he now found himself abandoned by allies, betrayed by his soldiers, and condemned by the very Senate that once called him a god. Disguised in simple rags, he slipped out of Rome in the dead of night. With him went only a handful of attendants, among them Sporus. Even in these final hours, Nero clung to the illusion he had built. He called Sporus by Poppæa's name, spoke to him of memories that were never his, and leaned on him as though the boy could anchor him against the tide of ruin. For Sporus, it was the sharpest cruelty of all, to comfort the man who had destroyed him. They reached a villa on the city's outskirts. There, Nero unraveled completely. He paced the halls like a caged beast, muttering lines of poetry, rehearsing his own death as if it were a final performance. "What an artist dies in me," he whispered, clinging to vanity even as the world closed in. When soldiers approached, Nero faltered. He could not take his own life without help. With a servant's hand guiding the blade, the emperor collapsed, dying not in glory, but in terror. Yet for Sporus, this was no liberation. The nightmare continued. Rome's new master saw him not as a victim, but as entertainment. Plans were drawn to cast him into the arena, dressed as a maiden from myth, to be violated before a roaring crowd. It was cruelty sharpened into spectacle, a final attempt to erase the last fragments of his humanity. But Sporus would not let Rome decide his end. At barely 20 years old, he chose death on his own terms. Poison, perhaps, or a hidden blade, no one knows for certain. What we do know is that in those final moments, he seized the one freedom that had always been denied to him, the power to choose his fate. Sporus's story is often reduced to a footnote in the Chronicles of Nero, remembered as a symbol of imperial decadence. But behind the spectacle was a boy who never had the chance to live his own life. From the moment Nero saw in him the shadow of Poppæa, Sporus was stripped of his identity, forced into a role that erased his name, his body, and his future. And yet his final act stands as both tragedy and defiance. By choosing death, he reclaimed the one thing denied to him in life: agency. His story reminds us that the grandeur of Rome was built not only on triumphs and monuments, but also on human suffering, stories of resilience and silent resistance that still echo across 2,000 years. Sporus's fate shows how power can erase identity, but also how even in despair, defiance remains possible. His final choice was tragic, yet it was his own.